speaker is Dr. Meera Velayudhan, and she has been involved in gender studies since its inception in India in the early 1980s, and to an extent conducted within the discipline of history. Her doctoral research focused on gender, caste, social reform, nationalism, and popular movements in Kerala, and an earlier CWDS study, the Coy workers' struggle in Kerala, was one of the studies which pointed to the complexities of studying gendered entities or identities in a context where structural changes were taking place in the industry. Her focus of the research since has been on strategies of organizations of women in various contexts, historical and contemporary, particularly of the marginalized women, the women's land rights, and women in conflict contexts. Dr. Meera has been part of designing and conducting courses attempting engaging methods of conducting gender studies and participating in international, including UN advocacy courses on genders at Rutgers University at USA. She is a policy analyst and the former president of the IAWS from 2018 to 2020. I invite you, Dr. Meera, for this talk on behalf of the Women's Studies Center as well as the Students' Welfare. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm really happy to be part of your program because I live in Cochin now, and this is the first one I'm sort of participating in. And so I'm really happy, and also I thought since broadly the theme was gender justice, I thought since in a contemporary context where farmers' struggles, etc. taking place, I'll talk about women's land rights. And so I have prepared a PowerPoint on that. And as I go along, I'll speak. So can I share the screen?
Yeah, please do so, Dr. Chinchu.
Yeah, I'll just...
Yeah, yes, ma'am. So you can use the share screen option on the bottom part of this Zoom window.
We are unable to see the screen, Dr. Chinchu.
Yeah. Are you trying to share it now, ma'am? Meera, ma'am? And you're also muted.
Yeah, Dr. Meera, you are muted.
Yes. It has started coming. Yes, it's visible now. But you're still muted. You need to unmute yourself.
Dr. Meera, we still can't hear you, though we can see your slides. Please unmute yourself. We can't hear. Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you hear
Unmuted
me?
now.
Yeah. Yes, please.
So this is some of the discussions that we are. The earlier presentation that was about whether women were active or whether there were assertions. And this is something that the Indian Association for Women's Studies, of which I am part, we've been conducting these discussions where the association is where women's studies meets movements and they feed each other, and that's how these kind of discussions that we are trying to conduct. And this is just one part of the discussion on the farmers' struggles. And this is more got to do with approaches to women's rights to land and land-based resources. And there are many groups. Five years back, I was actually settled in Gujarat. And there are 23 civil society organizations have formed a women's land rights group. And now they are there these groups are there all over India. And we've been conducting both studies and discussions based on these studies, and also studying various land movement of women's sort of rights to resource rights, to development resources. And so based on that, those discussions and those associations, I'm presenting this because I thought in Kerala, we really, this discussion has not really taken off. I mean, it's hardly there. So I thought, I'll just present it here in your seminar. And this is like why women's land rights, why are they important? And in fact, if we really look at the whole UN debates, UN, around Mexico, when the first UN conference was held, and since then, this whole question of, particularly from regions in the South, how the lack of productive assets for rural poor women were sort of raised in these conferences. And one of the slogans there was how women do so much of the world's work, earn so much, income is so less, but very little, only 1% of, in the 70s, in mid-70s, the 1% of the property owned by women. Then came the Status of Women Committee report it was the middle of the 70s, where because of the emergency, that report did not get the significance, but it is one of the key documents from late 70s onwards, 80s for looking at, the situation of status of women, what's happened to women, particularly in India in the post-independence period. And one of the things it showed was that apart from many sort of declines at many levels, including sex ratio, one of the things is how the female cultivators were decreasing. And there was an increasing number of female agricultural labor, which means that shift was taking place from cultivation to just becoming labor. And so land reforms at that stage, the committee report, which was a Government of India report at that time, mentioned how land reforms was very key to improve rural women's conditions. And interestingly, in the development debates of the 1980s and 1990s, the focus sort of shift from, to that, a lot of shift took place about rural and all how women, particularly large sections, were dependent on agriculture, particularly in the South and the whole Asian South, Asian region and our regions. And so it was also acknowledged from varied studies that women were denied access to rights to access, ownership and control of land, and few had direct ownership of land in their own right. And at that stage, there was very little data also about these gender asset gaps within a country, within states, or within across countries. And then the 1990s, the various developmental frameworks that were used, and one of them was a livelihood perspective, which sort of emerged among not only academicians but also multilateral and bilateral agencies and grassroots organization policymakers were talking about what is a livelihood group, perspective. And so therefore it was one of the important things about land and land-based resources and women's access came up in this particular approach, and how to look at rural life as integrated within specific contexts, across sectors, informed by both actions on the ground as well as engagements of varied kind, including academic. And so this sort of gender analysis, which sort of comes into this approach, it sort of does some very interesting things. One is how gender relations is interlinked with wider processes of change, and this sort of opened up one of the things is opening up the household. That is not to look at the household as a homogeneous. And you would see that Dr. late Sharda Mani, who I was sort of known since the 80s, I mean, it was she actually who held a big conference on opening up the household that was in Delhi in the ISI, and how these households are so varied and how they are linked with very broader economic and political structures. Many studies of South Asia at that period. So even rural markets were looked at social, political, and unequal. Then also they looked at how the role of institutions such as the state, the market, or even communities which are very diverse, and how do they manage natural resources. And it was also, the studies showed that these institutions were not gender neutral. None of these institutions, be it the state, market, or various households and families and of particular communities, these were not gender neutral. It was in this background that the women's entitled to land and land-based resource began to be addressed in the mid-1990s. And why does entitlements matter? So studies which show that the key factor that is linked with rural poverty was land. And in fact, some studies of Kerala also took place at that stage. And arable land was being analyzed as one of the most valued forms of property for its economic, political, and symbolic significance. Arable land, it sort of sustains livelihoods. And in areas where agriculture dominates livelihoods, land sort of also reduces the risk of poverty, or it also enhances food security. Women who own land, there are so many studies which I can share with you later with the center. They own land and control assets. They are in a better position to improve their lives and also cope in times of crises. And by owning land and homes also, homesteads, women directly gain from benefits of using that land, earning income, and also have a secure place to live. Research has shown that individuals who own land generate much higher rural non-farm earnings from self-employment than people without land. And they can also use land as, these are sort of possibilities, or land as collateral for credit during crisis, or investing in other kind of income generating. If you have something coming in from agriculture, you also have you may have the option to look at other income generation activities. And also that ownership by mothers have led to better outcomes of survival, education, and health of children than assets just owned by the fathers or menfolk. A study of marginal farmer households in Kerala showed, this is a 1990s study, that mother's cultivation of a home garden, the output that is where if she controls the output, had a positive effect on child nutrition. Also, that access and control over productive assets such as land also strengthened women's ability to sort of manage shocks and social risks. It could be even some disasters. Land is particularly critical resource for women when household breaks down, like migration, war, abandonment, violence, divorce, polygamous relations, illness, or death. So it's sort of something to fall back on. In regions where hunger and chronic undernutrition, women are often the main food growers. Rural women are responsible, this we've already said, how they produce about 60 or 80% of the food. Data, now it's like around 60% or 65, at least more recent data. So between secure land tenure and increasing agriculture, there has been a link, and also how land can be improved. And if this kind of land ownership, and they have control also over it. And how it sort of, it's such a critical productive asset for livelihood, and particularly rural poor women. And as majority of the tillers and agricultural workers and women are a major role in the household sort of sustaining itself, this plays a big sort of role in that. Then there are also, as I said earlier, that there are these, women are not a homogeneous category. There are, this particularly what is called female-headed household. Kerala has got a very large percentage of female-headed household. Single women, they're single in varied ways also. And female-headed households they become owing to conflict for varied reasons, for widowhood or, the ownership of land creates possibilities to stand on their own feet and even for drawing support from relatives. Land titles also serve as collateral in accessing development programs such as production credits for farmers. You need some kind of collateral. That's one of the struggles that is going on, that if you are a woman who's involved in land, it is only if you have ownership that you can get access to these credit. If, women are farmers in varied ways. They lease in, lease out, they work in family farms. So therefore, in all these different levels, you need access to development programs apart from just owning land title. This is one of the demands that have been put in varied 5-year plans. Women's movements and women economists have put these forward too. And then in regions where male migration is high and where women are principal farmers, that support, particularly if they don't own the land as such, like in Himachal Pradesh and some of these studies which have shown, it's very critical that such development program, there's access to that, which means that you need to also recognize what women are farmers in varied ways. They may not even own the land. And then this is a very interesting thing which we have discussed, is that what are the ways in which women, get access to land? One is inheritance or lineage, Then there is also, you get group rights, sort of collective rights, for common property rights and common lands which are there. And they are also linked to different land tenure systems. In India, there are many varied, in different states, there are varied land tenure systems, and then how do you get access to this? And these serve as sources of livelihood and substance, particularly they provide, this common property like forests and other thing, even common lands. They provide firewood, fodder, medicinal part, food products, etc. So they are really life-sustaining in a way, livelihood-sustaining. Also, there are the third dimension from which you can access state government land distribution. And you can also all purchase from the market, which is, of course, like much less percentage really have access to purchasing from the market. And then individual ownership, like to what extent is there freedom if you have individual ownership, a woman to lease out or lease in or mortgage or sell or bequeath? What is the extent of freedom? At all these junctures, women face more obstacles than men, the studies have shown. Then, like communities which have, many communities, particularly like Northeast in particular, they have informal arrangements or traditional methods of household and community decision making. I mean, the tribal council, for instance, in Northeast, they sort of allocate these plots to various members in the village and to women in particular, but they may not have direct rights on those land in terms of ownership. And in most of South Asia, women traditionally do not own property since land is inherited through male family lineage. Of course, Kerala, you have this matrilineal inheritance thing among varied sections. But even that has sort of, as we see now, that those has really eroded. Many studies have shown that over the years it's become more patrilineal and in fact commercialized. And customary law often related to marriage bar women from obtaining primary rights to land. Rather, only use rights are there through fathers, husbands, brothers. In areas like in Punjab, Haryana, where all these farmer struggles are going on, there have been a lot of resistance to women's ownership to land. And customary laws, this is a very interesting thing because particularly, the case of like, if there is what is known as customary laws, they say they may be giving some access to, but not ownership, then for the legal systems or the government programs, if they sort of give, if you can access a government program or something only because you you need a criteria of owning that land, and also it has to be individual ownership. And government programs are designed in that way. Then it creates sort of a kind of a tension, because access is not ownership, and the secondary rights also become weaker, because once the government program or the distribution is to individuals, so even the secondary rights which the community or tribal council might be giving to individual households, to women, those can get weakened with sort of these newer legal systems. And the case here is that Nagaland, there's been an intense struggle, because Nagaland is a place where women have never had political rights. They're there, they're not in any of the tribal council, but they are the ones who actually are given the access to the land to cultivate. And when the Panchayati Raj, there was the struggle to sort of enact some of these representation at local levels, and even in the state level, there's a big struggle. And so that has not still taken place in, for instance, in Nagaland. And, so therefore, these kind of how they interact with larger systems from the central government, or laws or government programs, these are very sort of significant to say what is customary laws, which are in any case also changing. So therefore, I mean, more and more studies are needed to sort of capture, what's happening, what is the kind of changes taking place, to say which were traditionally matrilineal communities. And then there are these new laws and new government programs which talk about individual ownerships, and women do not have that kind. They have access but do not have ownership. So what happens? So I think more and more studies are coming forward to how the customary laws interface with varied legal systems at different stages, whether it be in a particular community in Assam or Garo in Nagaland, and also, the constitutional schedules, the 6th schedules, so they're individual-based formal, how they interact with individual-based formal legal ownership, And if a lot of the conflicts in the Northeast have also got to do with these kind of tensions of larger programs coming forward, and customary laws changing, and how they are to sort of interact with the new programs, many central government programs also. There's also the, like, one needs to capture what is the kind of transition that's taking place in norms of matrilineal society to that of a patrilineal society. And Kerala is very much an example of that. What are the processes that is leading to much more of a, not only patrilineal but patriarchal ownership in terms of access and then economic changes. What are the changes in cultivation that's taking place? From food crop to commercial crops, and cultural changes where more families sort of upward mobility, and urbanization influences, how these sort of impact the social processes at the local levels, and how they sort of impact either customary laws or what are the nature of changes taking place. And for instance, customary laws of a particular community interpretation, because women are not in those councils, So the interface with modernity is not in favor of women in that. And similarly, there's Meghalaya also, how, and which allows these changes which are taking place in some of these areas. National legislation do not hold up community ownership rights to land perceived as state's property with power to alienate land from traditional communities. This is a big contentious, because the whole Land Alienation Act and all the debates in the parliament when it was amendments took place has also got to do with, this community ownership, whether it's tribals or even fishing community or other kind of common lands also are using, how these sort of, and once they're seen as state's property, how they sort of, land use pattern sort of changes, not only in villages, but also even within communities, leading to resource crisis and huge social impacts. And more and more, sort of social control over resources by men and not individual ownership, with state encouraging commercial crops and loans being given to individual farmers and heads of household perceived as men. So the process of change to individual sort of male ownership, more likelihood of that happening, and it is happening also, And governance is I've already told you how governance is a very significant issue, because one is that particularly in Northeast, what's happening now in Northeast in all these conflict taking place over there has also got to do about this. I've already talked about how individual ownership becomes legal and prepares the ground also for land alienation. So the tribal councils who are the powerful may alienate land or take individual lands in their own names, And in many where there's not a single, one tribe may not be there, So the potential for conflict also, this is the whole colonial heritage which is there. Then codification, if we are asking about codification of customary law, then there could be also this whole thing about a uniform. Then what is the uniformity that is? Is it going to be one homogeneous kind of thing, or do they look at the cultural as well as the different diversities among the different communities and tribes? So these are big discussions going on, particularly in terms of land and resource rights. So we need to look at actually how customary law is practiced on the ground in specific contexts in terms of access, ownership, control of land and other land-based resources. And there are studies of this kind. So so therefore we can see that how land rights intersect with other, intersections with discriminatory inheritance pattern, privatization of community lands and indigenous lands, in Adivasi areas, as well as gendered control over economic resources and right to work. So therefore, these are sort of significant how women sort of influence and shape women's access to access and rights and ownership to land, other land-based resources. And I'll just very quickly go over this. That is that, there have been a lot of advocacy. And I myself also, when I was in Delhi in 1980s, working with the Center for Women's Development Studies. I was as a student and as a researcher there. The first time the shift really took place was when the 6th plan. And that's got to do with the kind of work that went in from gender studies as well as from varied kind of struggles that were going on the ground, And for the first time, there was a chapter on, women in the plan. And so you can imagine, since independence, it's only in 1980 that 85, that plan, 6th plan, that, women's economic independence, joint titles, this even some studies in Kerala also have noticed that these joint titles are really, it's a policy. Since then, it's continuously been a policy in all plan documents, but when, say, government allocates land or housing and all these joint titles are not always given. So there's a big discussion going on that, all including transfer of asset. And for, like particularly where land or house sites or housing and beneficiary-oriented economic units. So this was recognized by the 6th plan itself, And, according to the political contingencies at the national level, these plans had an impact, So what happened is in the next plan, it did not really review the progress of the 6th plan on joint title, because if you're going into a one plan, like Kerala is going to now go into drafting the 14th plan. The 13th plan is what's ongoing, and now the 14th Kerala state is going to. So do you do a review of what happened in the last, and what happened with the joint radical, so the plan itself noted that there was no review done of the earlier thing, but it said that how, that larger number of households headed by women, there should be, sort of, one is ceiling surplus, and also how it should, these benefits of land titling and land being given, land distribution should go to larger number of households, particularly those who are headed by women, and also, there was a discussion. So we can see, there was because of the kind of gender studies and the movement, there was a very interesting kind of intersection in the debate and in shaping the 5-year plan. There was, unlike now, we really had we could, there were a lot of, what do you say, a consultative process was there, a dialogue process was there with the state at that stage, so these studies and what they brought out and what program designs, these one could sort of impact. And the 8th 5-year plan also shows that, it sort of laws, talks about changes in laws and inheritance of property to protect the interests so that they get equal share in parental property, whether inherited or self-acquired, And so also you need social legislations alongside, which would help sort of groups. And also, these are all the kind of shifts, conceptual shifts that takes place because of the kind of studies input as well as advocacy efforts that are taking place. These kind of, very quickly I'll go through these. And the 9th plan, this, talks about more about land, collective, women's collectives getting, being able to, being access to land when they can conserve the land as well as improve and cultivate the women's collectives which are there. And rights of tenants and sharecroppers need to be recorded. I think this recording is very important, particularly for security of tenure. For instance, in Bengal, although land was distributed and large scale had taken place, there was a very shortage of recording of security of tenure. So with the change in governments that took place there, the former, owners and landed sections started grabbing back. And so the kind of changes that are taking place.
Please, Ms. Divya Krishna, please mute your mic. Thank you.
So you can see that, how then it goes on to sectoral, how you need to look at a whole sector, and then also recognition of feminization of agriculture will be as a concern at policy level, So many of the things that we are discussing in gender studies and the studies that came out started figuring in the conceptual shifts in the government's plan documents itself, And so therefore, that's a big change from what's happening now because, this whole dialogue process and consultative process with the civil society group, with economists, with various academic institutions and studies, that was there. There was that space for that was there, and how growth has to be inclusive, for larger sections to sort of avail of these rights. And there was, in fact, the chapter, this women economists played a very important role because they were made as a working group within the plan document process itself, all Devaki Jain and Beena Agarwal. There were many economists. Mridul Epan was also part of this from Kerala. And so, the much more of the studies and particularly group approach to subsidies, infrastructure support, and examples and case studies were given. I think these are very important in informing government planning and process, that you give data and you give examples and you also cite sort of cases that have working on the ground. So therefore, these are very, very important in the whole discussion. And there's a big shift which takes place in the 11th plan is that where this whole thing of women's agency, and therefore, organizations of women at local levels, at rural women's groups, and how programs need to be directed at these. And these also need to, particularly in areas where there's an agrarian crisis or farmer suicides or going to crop failure, or unable to pay the loans, how they need to look at mobilizing women and having more collective approaches, And then also different kind of approaches also change in terms of, credit support, recording and legal support, incentives, subsidies, particularly for poor landless and tribal women over forest land, commons and other resources, So I think there's the shift was also very progressively, progressively it was moving forward in a sense, parallel to the debates and the data that is emerging from gender studies, from varied economists and particularly experts and women, as well as many kind levels of impact from data on the ground that could impact the sort of design as well as the conceptual shifts of the planning process. Planning process actually in the Indian Constitution, it says that planning is actually very key to democratization, because it's the planning process itself, and the plan has to be put before Parliament, and then there has to be a discussion in the Parliament and has to be passed at that level. So that whole democratization, and at this level where you could sort of, dialogue and consult and feed data and examples of alternatives, these are very significant, and they sort of, the approaches kept changing and in a sort of progressive manner. And also, this interesting, after so many years, 50 years almost, the Hindu Succession Act gets in. In the Constitutional Assembly debates, Baba Saheb Ambedkar also resigned because this women's right to property, there was so much of which he had put forward at, the Indian National, which was the ruling parties, and the Assembly itself went for this larger opposition to women's property, particularly from Punjab, Bihar, all these areas which are heavily, feudal and landed interests who are representing them. And so therefore, it's 50 years it took to talk about women, that they can claim rights through inheritance, So the Hindus, which was amended, I think it was 28. Then, you cannot say that only some land laws, if there are there, you have access and you have rights to land, but you also need, alongside other gender equal laws have to be there. So there has to be, it's not just only just, so this property rights as well as other kind of, unequal laws. If other laws are unequal, you cannot have equality at this, in terms of even rights to land. If at other levels, there is inequality, So also recording women's claims, increasing legal awareness, providing legal sort of legal aid, and also supportive measures are sort of needed for these, And the varied state intervention, national land reforms were set up in the rural development to prepare a new land reforms policy. And one of the things which came up here is the whole term of women as farmers. And that is still an ongoing kind of struggle. And also, there are also democratic elements to the planning process, that plans are public documents. There has to be a debate, not only at Parliament level, but also publicly, that there is an exchange of these are circulated and should be answerable to Parliament, spaces for consultation, debates, advocacy, and also the whole question of political will. And so, I'll sort of end over here, and I've very quickly gone over the plan documents and the whole spaces for democratic dialogues, which are very important to put this debate forward, And I'd like to really, for this discussion, I'd really like to thank one. I told you I was living in Gujarat for a decade, and was part of this working group on, it's a sort of organization of 23 civil society organizations, and we managed to sort of impact a lot of the state panchayat, their literacy, their documents, their sort of modules, many other levels, including implementation, accessing government program. Then Bina Agarwal, she's has done a lot of work on women's, and all of works need to be, students and researchers should really look at that. I can share those with. And there was the Women and Child Secretary, Women and Child Department, Sujaya. Unfortunately, she's unwell now, and so in terms of dementia, but she played a very important role in sort of analyzing the plans. And I was lucky to be able to, see some of her writings and her work, And so I think this debate really needs to, there are these, I have sort of put these forward in the sense that, we really need to bring this debate, particularly if you're in Kerala in particular, some bit on women's, because of the shifts that have taken place in terms of even customary laws or matrimony and others, and how there's actually a kind of regressive trends sort of coming in, and all these violence and these so-called it's called dowry murders. Actually, they're actually murders which are taking place because of these secondary status of women that is taking place in communities which earlier sort of had much more recognized status for women. And so therefore, this is what I'd like to put forward, and maybe at some other stage, one can discuss the other dimensions of this debate on women in agriculture. So thank you so much for giving me this opportunity to put forward this very significant, and since farmer struggles are ongoing, how it's important to bring this debate into that dialogues taking place. It's still not there. And so as women studies people, as people who are working with sort of advocacy groups on women's land and resource rights, it's important to bring this forward. And also for students who, who are researchers who are doing work on resource and rights, it's important to see some of these older debates, how it emerged, this women's land and resource rights, both national and international contexts, and how the various studies in different states in India sort of shaped these discussions, and how there was a space for dialogue with the state, which is declining, and how it's necessary to point out these things and recall these things and work out how to go forward. So thank you for this.
Thank you, Dr. Meera, for that very erudite presentation on agriculture and women's issues. We will have some time here for a few questions. If anybody in the audience would like to have a clarification or a discussion with Dr. Meera. Okay, in the meantime, when the audience makes up their question, I would like to, I have a small clarification. Yes. When we look at the context of Kerala, where agriculture really has been on the decline over the last so many decades, what are the steps that the government is taking to ensure that women participate more and these land rights are shifted to women? Because you still see a lot of land that is unused, which is left fallow, and then over a period of time, their land use is changed.
Yes. In fact, from 70s, 1980s itself, these, even these sort of small plots in the kitchen, like around the plots, the little bit of land, a place you may have around your house, these households, that cultivation itself, they started declining from about the 70s, late 70s, 80s, So those were support, for your household sort of small plants and things that you used to plant over there, those had already declined. And in fact, Kerala is now dependent on food crops from other states. We are totally dependent, and growth is very, really, very little. But interesting thing that's happening now is that, there are two. One is that, I'd like to point out, because I had done some studies, historical ones as well as more contemporary in Kuttanadu area, So one of the things in the villages which I had looked at is that when land reforms took place, what happened, were women given land. So I found that it was very varied. It was very varied, particularly land going to Dalits and, various other sections, Iravas and who had got more of tenancy rights and all which got back. So I saw that it was the response in various districts and regions were very different. In some areas where clusters where land was distributed, there, say about 30% of women did get, single women did get land, at that stage. These are very old records looking at historical, documents of that period. In some areas, we find that as soon as they get the land, they sell it off because they already own, they're already living in some, what is known as garden land adjacent to where they used to work, cultivate in the landlord's area. They were known as certain grounds which were there, which they had sort of traditionally occupied, so they preferred to be there, so varied ways. But there was no, if you see the whole, Dr. Sharda Mani has done, I think the pioneering study that she did was on women, land reforms, what happened to women in land reforms in Kerala. I think it was, I don't know whether it was an ICSR study or it was a mimeograph, but I have seen it in the 80s, in which, the whole assembly debate on land reform which was taking place, and that time the late K.R. Gauri was the minister for, land reform. She actually pioneered that whole enactment in the assembly. And in that there was very little discussion on women, on gender in the debate itself, So there was not, but on the ground level, in some areas, there was this distribution which was taking place, which were also going to single-headed and female-headed households. Some places not, but some places. So it was very diverse. That's a historical part. The other thing is that now, for instance, Kudumbashree has been done quite a lot of the collectives, these are joint, those joint liability groups which are there. So in many areas in Palghat and some other areas, they're really sort of reviving. And once they take it up, it's they are able to cultivate that. More sort of emphasis needs to be given, and also that also, it's not only just self-sustaining for the household, but also some sort of market avenues when they, as collective, that they are cultivating various things, but it needs to, of course, go ahead much more. But there is that revival is taking place. And I think that's a very good move, and it's been taking place for some years now. But and women forming these collectives and then going into various kinds of productions, at least in that local levels, if some self-sustaining, cultivation takes place, for the local level access, particularly food crops and of varied kind, and I think this is what they are sort of looking at, and it has started. But still it is, at a, like not the kind which can sort of have a big impact on food security of the state itself, that you don't have to import from other states. And a lot of rice was coming from Andhra and those areas to Kerala, that you're depending on the Food Corporation of India for share in the food. So I mean that is there, but in terms of public perception, actually, one finds that if you see the rising case of violence against women and all, you can see that there's really in communities which may have given, say, some resource to women, now it's sort of a fallback. It's going backwards. And so therefore, it's all the more important to bring this discussion in where you say that women's economic independence is very important, where that kind of principle is upheld. We also need to say that women have their own rights to an access and control also over. So therefore, it also impacts how family, at the family and household levels, how are families and households perceived by communities, by people, by society, by the political process, by the political class. That so many different levels that you need this perception change. And also only if you push from the ground through studies, through showing alternatives, through sort of advocacy and more of research on these to show, how this can make a difference if say, tribal women who are losing. There are areas in tribal areas where there is hunger, starvation taking place, and how, whether these kind of alternatives can be take place to, these rights, entitlements, which is actually the nationally accepted policy as well as in the constitution. These sort of really, this debate should take roots here, before we look at what's happening, looking into study, at least the debate we put forward. In Kerala, it's really lacking. It's quite strong in some of the other states. And because groups are active over there, academic groups as well as they combine, they sort of come together. So I think it's very much needed here in, so I hope in CUSAT also you're able to sort of generate more of this discussion on women in agriculture and women's, access to land and resource rights, so that we can, in all the programs, even in the region here in Cochin and in this area, is at least some impact on Customary itself, because we are not debating with Customary also. We know that they exist over there and there's discussion, but civil society and other academic groups, we need to interact with these institutions, and bring forth the kind of findings that we are finding, so that there is a sort of feedback, and we learn also from that level. So what are the issues at the ground level, and particularly in COVID times, I think these are, where work is, people are losing their work avenues, and particularly those who do not have any access to any entitlements to any resources, they are the most vulnerable sections. So I think it's very important for when we say that we need to build a new Kerala to bring some of these discussions to center stage.
Are there any questions?
Yeah, ma'am, adding on to what the chair said,
Yes.
even though you said that there are 5-year plans, the earlier stage, of course, the 5-year plans are, even the first 5-year plan was giving predominant importance to agriculture sector. Then after that, it changes, depends upon the situations, it changes. Then in the later stage, as you said, it was given even the land as well as agriculture, even the women, etc. Right? Still, there is a Customary units. Now there is another term, the part of the government, that is what do you call Tozhilurappu Paddhathi. In Malayalam we call it as. So many things are coming, but still, what ma'am said, that Sanitha ma'am said, why still there is the depends on agriculture sector is coming down nowadays.
I don't
Even
know.
though all programs are there.
I don't know whether there is statistics to show that there is taking place. Also, significant agriculture in people's people are getting educated. They don't want to go back into traditional household cultivation, want to go into other occupations. So you need a lot of in my study, which I did, there's a very interesting study of, indebtedness among Dalit communities. This was in, around Kottayam side, Kottayam Alleppey side. And the women were saying very interestingly what they were saying in relation to caste, They're saying that we now work, although, we can choose where to go and work, but we still work on certain landed sections planned, And there is some kind of, some of the old hasn't totally gone off, but they felt that if they there can be group wise cultivation and there is access to land for that cultivation, then they feel that they can, there's more dignity and even more sections, different kind of women coming together, So in a sense that they felt it could be more inclusive, And I think these, it's not that there's a decline. I think efforts are taking place, but we need an overall debate on this, state-wise, and there's not that kind of discussion on this, why we are so dependent on, because so much of, Kerala has so much during the COVID, food kits were given, all these rations were given, all these were very unusual from other states that were taking place. So I think we are also getting very dependent on the state to provide, these things and particularly for food security, So therefore, also discussion needs to be much more on how to, increase agricultural production and how to be self-sufficient. It's very important. Food security is really part of freedom of a state, A federal state and having its own freedom is also to have food security. So we need newer kind of, discussions and dialogues to get it across to wider sections that, how, what is the way, because there was really, I remember in my studies in the 80s and 90s and even 20 early, the last decade also, there's a lot of, from economists itself, they felt that small plots are not viable, There was that whole, perception even among those who are in planning process in Kerala that small plots are not viable. Whereas in many other states, when these women's collectives and others, collectively these land was given to communities or to sections of marginalized, it showed that it's possible to, with kind of different kinds of support systems, maybe credit, maybe loans. Through that, it's possible to regenerate and to, build some kind of self-sufficiency in terms of food, food, access to food, and particularly food crops, And so I think that there are different levels of opposition to, whether it's feasible or not in Kerala context. You generally dismiss and say, oh, people are not interested in doing agriculture and all that. But, there are that Kudumbashiri units actually shown that it's possible to do land-related, cultivation of varied kinds, and it's possible to sell them also, and also sell it not only local level, but others. Now there is, going at marketing it also. They have, but these are still at a very, stage. But I like to look at the brighter side of things.
It's true, ma'am. But we are claiming that Kerala is claiming that the public distribution system is very effective, but still it's a failure.
No, public distribution, I don't think public distribution is a failure. I don't think so, because food, the thing is that we should not be totally welfare dependent, We have to generate these resources from the ground so that, and because local self-governance is strong in Kerala, at these local levels in the planning process, where does this kind of production of, food crops or food items, where does it figure in the local planning process? So I won't say the public distribution system. I think it's good in Kerala, but the point is that we need to actually have something that's sustainable and not only dependent on welfare.
No, that actually what happened is that during the 2 or 3 floods in Kerala, which
Yes.
was affected even the Kutanad, our
Yes.
rice bowl.
Yes,
Actually,
yes.
that affected, but nothing has taken seriously
No,
to,
in fact,
to regain that loss in the production, right?
no, in fact, we did a study with Dr. Sanal Mohan in NG University. We've done actually a study. I'll share it with you. We did a study of the, the impact of what happened with the floods and what's happening with, relief and rehabilitation and what's happening to various communities, and things are, there has been there is a lot of, and now with COVID on top of that, and not lack of work itself, there is a lot of work to be done actually.
Yes.
And yeah, so that we have to accept, if you have to say you want to have a new Kerala or you want to, Navodhanam or whatever it is, we also need to see what's happening on the ground. And I'll share some of these studies with you so that we've actually did in the COVID period itself, we did these also post flood. Immediately we did study of some 4 or 5 districts, and I myself went to some of the colonies in Kuttanadu area. And we did a lot of interviews and some studies. So share it and see that, what are the kind of challenges which are there, Are they in terms of government programs, access to all women, all the communities not having any entitlements? All these are sort of interlinked.
Yeah, that's why I asked the question.
Yeah.
There are challenges. That's why.
I'm sort of hopeful.
Will there be any more questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Meera Velayudhan for her talk related to land use and the women's issues and how it impacts women as well as food security and every other social or community aspects, and why it is important to have a larger discussion in various forums on this particular issue. On behalf of the Women's Study Center and the Department of Youth Welfare of Cochin University of Science and Technology, I thank Dr. Meera Velayudhan for her talk. I would now like Dr. Chinchu to say a few words to conclude this session.
Thank you, ma'am. And a big thanks to Dr. Meera Velayudhan too. Since Dr. Meera is in Kochi, once the restrictions are over and once the normal returns, we will definitely think of some physical programs too. In fact, some of the things that she pointed out need to be in the research agenda of academic institutions, including the Women's Studies Center. So we will definitely be doing that too. And I would also thank the other two guests of the day, Dr. Shalini and Advocate Sandhya too, for presenting very vivid topics and generating a good discussion on them too. And we have this is to the participants. I have posted a small link in the chat box. This is if you remember, yesterday we had discussed about the gender light bulb moment, in which a moment in the life which makes us think about our gender. So this is the link to submit that assignment as a written thing. You can either type in the response as probably a paragraph or upload it in the form. There is provision for both in the form. Okay, shall we wind up, Sarita ma'am?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
Yeah.
So we conclude. Yeah, please.
Yeah. I also thank Dr. Sarita. As always, she has been very much professional and academic in the conduct of the session. Keeping the time and leading the discussions. She has been a very great help for us in the past too. So I specifically thank Dr. Sarita for for chairing the session and conducting the discussion so fruitfully on behalf of the Women's Studies Center and the Department of Youth Welfare. Okay. So Meera ma'am will be okay. I'll be in touch with you, Meera ma'am. So
Yes,
and I will share the resources with the participants
sure,
also.
sure.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Yeah. Thank you all.